Everybody, welcome to the second Melbourne City of Literature Between the Lines sessions. My name is Astrid Edwards and I am asking the questions today. I'll begin by acknowledging the country where I am living and working. I am on Dja Dja Wurrung country, which is about an hour north of Melbourne and the City of Literature. The City of Literature itself and our guest today, Jennifer Down, are on Wurundjeri country, and I acknowledge the elders past and present, and that sovereignty was never ceded. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, I'd like to introduce you to the Cities of Literature Network. They may not be familiar with your work, but everybody who is a reader and writer in Australia is very much familiar with your body of work, Jennifer. So you have published 3 novels, Our Magic Hour, Pulse Points, and most recently, Bodies of Light. I have Bodies of Light here, of course. Bodies of Light is a really highly awarded work in Australia. It was published in 2021 and won kind of all of the awards in 2022, including the Miles Franklin Literary Award, which is one of, if not the most prestigious literary award in Australia, and was also shortlisted for the Stella Prize, which is, you know, the other most prestigious literary prize in Australia. So well done. But also your previous 2 books were also highly awarded. And in what kind of amuses me a great deal, you were named a Sydney Morning Herald Young Novelist of the Year twice, which I'm pretty sure is unheard of. Some people get it once, but twice is rare, Jennifer.
Josephine Rowe, who is another fantastic Australian writer, has done it at least twice, if not 3 times. So
oh my goodness. Okay, well, yeah. That only makes 2 of you. Now, we're going to talk a lot about Bodies of Light, but before we went there, which is your favorite work, looking back, of the 3 novels?
Oh gosh, it's hard to say. I mean, that it's so different, and I think your relationship to any work changes, you know, with distance and time. I also don't tend to reread or revisit my work unless I don't know, very occasionally I might have to, not have to, I might revisit. So Pulse Points, my second book, is a collection of short stories, whereas the other 2 are novels. And I sometimes will revisit that, the short stories, if I'm teaching or if I have to do a short reading or something like that. I think I might be quite horrified by Our Magic Hour if I revisited that, but it holds a special place, you know, because it was like, first baby, I suppose. And then Bodies of Light has, I guess the publication of that and its reception has really I don't know, it's not, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that it's really changed my life and it's changed my career. It's sort of the way that book was received in Australia has has completely sort of altered my career trajectory. So that, you know, it would be disingenuous to say that one doesn't hold a special place in my heart.
I'm going to come later on to kind of how your career has changed with Bodies of Light, because I'm fascinated by prizes, and I think our international audience might enjoy hearing about kind of how prizes work in Australia. But before we go there, I would like to talk about Bodies of Light. It is your most well-known work, and it's going to stay in print for years. Like, this is now kind of part of contemporary Australian literature. Can you introduce it to our international audience?
Yeah, of course. So Bodies of Light tells the story of a woman who we come to know as Maggie, among other names. And it's essentially her life story from the ages of birth or very early childhood through to middle age. And she is a person who grows up in what we call in Australia out-of-home care. And very, you know, if you're listening to this and not watching, I'm using sort of swoosh swoosh quotation marks to talk about care. What I mean is the foster care system, yes, but also residential care. And what that looks like is different in, you know, across the world, of course, but it's a model of out-of-home care. So children who, for whatever reason, have been removed from their parent, guardian, primary caregiver, and are placed effectively as wards of the state. And foster care is one model of out-of-home care, but over the years, there have been things like, of course, orphanages and what we call children's homes or family homes. which is a very euphemistic way of describing that sort of structure. And so I guess that's the preamble. It's about someone who grows up in this out-of-home care system, and her life through to middle age. I really wanted to look at the Australia, like many other nation states around the world, has a pretty poor track record when it comes to looking after our most vulnerable children and young people. And I wanted to kind of explore the effects of long-standing trauma and of systemic abuse on very young marginalized people.
That is an excellent context in terms of kind of the areas of Australian history and contemporary history, to be honest, that you were kind of writing into. But can you introduce us to Maggie? And
yes,
because this was published 2 years ago, spoilers are okay.
Okay, so sorry, I felt quite aware of the international audience here, so I really felt like I needed to give a brief rundown of the care system. But thank you for bringing me back on track. So Maggie is she is a fiercely I sort of resist the word resilient, but I think that word has been used a lot in reviews. She does absolutely everything she can to survive. She often makes poor choices, but they are usually made from a very sort of bloody-minded place of just wanting to get to the next safer situation. So she grows up in the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne, coincidentally where I grew up. These are not even this part of the book is set in the 70s and 80s, and even now these are not fashionable suburbs. They're very they've changed a lot over time, and many of them are much more sort of I don't know, exciting and multiculturally diverse and rich now than they were in the 70s, but they remain quite working class, quasi-industrial areas. So that's where the story begins. And over time, we sort of follow Maggie through a series of different foster homes, children's homes, different living arrangements, until she reaches the age of 18, where she is ejected from the care, swoosh, swoosh, quotation marks, system. And so this is, in Australia, this is, Maggie is someone who we would talk about being a care experienced person or a care survivor. And at this point, she's actually able to gain entry to university, but it proves, I guess, too much of a culture shock for her. There's very little support, beyond the sort of financial aid of a scholarship or whatever else. The actual transition from living in care and being a ward of the state to living independently, and kind of mixing in this cultural milieu of quite wealthy people, among other things, proves really challenging. And it's at this point that she receives her records from her time in care. And what I guess what happens is that, and this is very much a true story, unfortunately. This is this happens all the time, but she requests records from the state because she wants to know more about her family and her childhood. And with such a dislocated upbringing, she feels as though there are lots of blind spots in her memory. And when she does receive these records, there's very little in there. There's no birth certificate, there's no immunization records, there's no photos, and it kind of throws up more questions than it answers. And that, I guess, destabilizing effect is sort of round two of that. It's the next part of that ripple effect of her early childhood years, that propels her into adulthood. And you've said no spoilers, sorry. You said spoilers are okay.
You can have spoilers. I know you're used to talking about editing this out of your conversations, but it's okay.
No, sorry, I did just take an allergy medication, so I know if that's so she this sort of search for identity, or lack of understanding of her identity, or of her past, or trying to reconstitute her past, is something that follows Maggie throughout her life. And she winds up married quite young to a guy, and they have three babies in quite quick succession, and each of these babies dies of sudden infant death syndrome. And as is the case, just now in the last couple of years, we've started to learn that there are in fact genetic and environmental links. And so it is now believed that there's a biological basis. We don't quite know what it is, but there is a biological basis for some of what we refer to as cot death or SIDS. But back in the day, obviously, 3 infant deaths in one family looked incredibly suspicious. And so after the death of her 3rd child, Maggie is arrested and charged with infanticide, which is a kind of specific code, a specific charge of manslaughter within the Victorian judicial system. And from there, we see her, I guess, reinvent herself. She decides it's this, as is often the case, this very long, drawn-out legal proceeding. At some point, she is released on bail. Women who commit infanticide are often seen as being at little risk to anyone else, with the possible exception of themselves. And so she's released on bail and makes this decision to effectively disappear and erase herself. And she goes on to do this a second time as well. She sort of starts afresh a couple of times. And from there, the remainder of the book is her moving from Australia to Aotearoa, New Zealand, where she has a sort of brief but very intense relationship with a woman there. And then she meets a man called Jeff from the States, ends up moving to Ann Arbor, Michigan to live with him and marry him. And they stay together for quite a long time. And in each of these relationships and kind of geographical context, she's reconstituting herself as a new person and trying to sort of make herself anew in the absence of these sort of typical artifacts of self that any one of us might sort of reasonably expect to have, whether they're tangible things like photos or report cards, or less tangible things like, being able to turn to a sibling or a parent or a childhood friend and say, do you remember when we did X, Y, Z? Maggie doesn't have any of those things. And so the rest, her whole life is her trying to assemble a sense of self, I suppose.
That was a really beautiful overview, Jennifer. Thank you. So many of the themes are universal. This is a story that, while extreme in some elements, does happen around the world, particularly the experience of care and surviving what happens in institutions like that. What drove you to fictionalize this? And it's, this is really quite a long book. It's kind of at the upper end of most of what is published in Australia. Our novels here tend to be quite short, and this is not.
Yes.
Like, what drove you to put this into fiction?
I think it is a long book, and sorry, Astrid, as I was trying to give that synopsis, I was like, God, I'm only a third of the way through. It is a long book, and it kind of asks a lot from the reader thematically, as you've alluded to it. So I was drawn to I guess fictionalize this story, but partly because both of my parents were welfare workers, social workers. My mum worked for a long time with very young children. So actually, her clients were often not yet born, and the upper end of that scale was about 2 years old. And my dad, on the other hand, he was actually a high school teacher. He is a high school teacher, but his predominant role was as welfare coordinator, which is, it's not quite guidance counselor. That role doesn't even exist in a lot of schools here, but his job was, it involved counseling, it involved connecting students with particular services. And he worked with students who were in the upper end of high school, year 11 and 12. So hopefully about to graduate and leave school. And he worked at a school with a very high proportion of kids who experienced homelessness, substance abuse, difficult living conditions. And so I suppose talking about, growing up, we were one of those families that ate dinner together every night. And it wasn't as though my parents were coming home and sort of telling my sisters and I stories about everything that had happened in their days. But we were certainly aware that there were people who lived differently to us, and that there were parents or caregivers who needed extra help to do their jobs, and that there were young people who needed a lot more support, and who were not receiving it. And so I think I was always aware at some level of out-of-home care and its failings. I guess when you're a welfare worker, or the child of two welfare workers, you're hearing a lot and thinking a lot about sort of the systemic failures and the chronic underfunding. And as I got older and maybe more media literate, I started to realize that it was something that was really underreported and under-discussed, both in Australian media and also in literature. And I guess here is the sticky ethical point, right? Because ideally, there would be more stories told by care survivors or care experienced people. I'm not a care experienced person, as I'm always at pains to point out. And so ideally, as I said, there would be more own voices, narratives in this space. And there is just such a dearth. I mean, I can think of two in Australia in recent years, both of which are great. But I guess that was kind of the decision I made, was that maybe it's better for me to shine a light on this, even in an imperfect way, and from the perspective of somebody who is not care experienced, but has just done a lot of research and interviews and things like that. And that was sort of the ethical, it wasn't a gamble. I guess it was a calculated gamble. It was a calculated decision that I made. And I guess, I always say I can't be the person to judge if I've been successful or whatever. But there's kind of a hopeful or optimistic, maybe like a Pollyanna part of me that thinks that, if maybe 10 more people are kind of cognizant now of some of the failings of the systems that are intended to protect our most vulnerable young people, then maybe things are better than they, maybe this book has done something good.
I don't think it's Pollyanna to think that, and also, it's not an overstatement to say that the publication of Bodies of Light has kind of opened up a public dialogue in certain areas that maybe wasn't there, because so many people have read this book and talked about it. What have the responses from readers, perhaps those who have, who are care survivors, or those who are not and are just, literary readers, what have been the responses, and has that changed over time?
It's interesting. I think I'm sure there are people who have read it and don't care for it.
That always happens. We don't need to worry about that.
Yes, not every book is for every person, and so on. I think I have been surprised by because neither of my previous books, I was really lucky, they were well received, but they weren't they didn't sell loads of copies. They were fairly modestly received, which is true for most books in Australia. I think I have been surprised by the number of people who have written or gotten in touch in some capacity, whether that's at a writers' festival or via email to. I mean, obviously, it's lovely to read, an email saying this really resonated with me or it really touched me in some way. But I think what's been surprising is the number of people who have sort of trusted me with their stories. The number of people who have read the book and then sent me an email or come up after a Q&A or something to say, yeah, I spent some time in care between this year and this year, and or my sister is a foster care leaver, and blah 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 blah. And that has been quite surprising, because it's just the word privilege gets thrown around a lot, and I don't want to sound like a sort of Oscars acceptance speech, but it is a privilege to be trusted with people's stories, and particularly stories of what are often the most difficult memories or periods of their lives. And that has been really lovely. I think occasionally I've gone through periods of being a bit dismayed by, the occasional review, and I do try not to read them, but occasionally, somebody will say to me, I wasn't believable, like too much bad stuff happens to this one person. And they're never, what I will say is the people saying that are never people who have had any experience or knowledge of the system. They're always quite comfortable middle class, white people, frankly. And there are certainly things in this novel that ask the reader to suspend, disbelief. But what I will say is, the passages about the experiences of care leavers, that is unfortunately very much grounded in reality. And so, yeah, I mean, it's overwhelmingly, I've been very grateful to get to talk with people and to read their emails.
So you just mentioned, grounded in reality. You did a huge amount of research for this book. So it is fictional, but it is in no way made up, if that makes sense. Can you talk us through that research process? And, as you were researching, I imagine not just the big ethical question of, should I be the one to kind of write it, which is what you alluded to before, but how did you kind of make all the little tiny ethical decisions along the way of how you would kind of construct this fictional story to tell the real story?
Yeah, so the research was often quite forensic, actually. I spent a lot of time. There were a couple of really influential government reports that had been tabled in Parliament in Australia over the years. One of those was the 2004 Forgotten Australians report, which was an inquiry into the experiences of care leavers across, sort of the 20th century. Another one was a report tabled in the Victorian Parliament, so specific to the state of Victoria, called As a Good Parent Would, that looked at, that was 2014, 2015. And so that was a more contemporary look at systemic abuses within the residential care system. I spent a lot of time at the State Library going through everything from sort of annual reports from these children's homes, which of course paint everything in quite a glossy light. There are photos of children, putting on nativity performances and playing tennis, and these sparkling clean bedrooms. I read a lot of care leaver and care survivor testimony. I did interview some people. I was really, before I sort of thought about this, I thought I'll interview lots of people, and then you sort of realize that you're potentially re-traumatizing survivors. And so very early on, I made the decision to just speak with people who, if it was a friend of a friend of a friend, and they heard that I was doing this project, and they were keen to share their experiences. I kind of made this decision that I wanted it to be a voluntary exchange, not me sitting down with my tape recorder and sort of probing them. What else? It was a lot of, I read a lot of sort of coronial inquests and things like that, a lot of literature on perinatal mental health. And I was really interested in the way that the judicial system, cops, but also the law responds to women who may not appear to be, perfect or good mothers. And, I mentioned earlier that this character, Maggie, is charged with 3 separate counts of infanticide of her own children. I was really interested in, there are kind of several, there are several cases that I read quite a lot about, and, I read a lot of court transcripts and things like that. I was really interested in the way that we, as a society, but as a judicial system, look at women who are poor or maybe don't have great literacy levels, or who don't have the education that might kind of bolster them in that context. Maybe women who haven't had the greatest upbringing themselves, and so our kind of cultural expectation that, well, if you had a crap childhood, then you can't possibly be a good mother. And so I was really interested in all of that stuff. And of course, a lot of it didn't make it into the book, but you're only ever showing like 10% of your working, I suppose. And I'm sorry, Astrid, I've forgotten the second part of your question. It was something to do with the ethics of.
Oh, just, I think you have answered that. The idea of, for example, how you chose not to, ask for lots of interviews because,
yes,
yeah, re-traumatizing. So that's the research process. And, Jennifer, I'm sure many people have said this to you, but it sounds incredibly intense. And I have no doubt it would have taken a lot out of you. What was it like then? You obviously got a publisher, you had an editor, you knew this was going to go out into the world in some form. How did it then kind of get, edited and polished up and packaged up to be marketed? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, it's interesting. My editor and I've been lucky enough to work with the same brilliant editor on all of my books, Elena Gugulis, at Text Publishing, and she has the hugest brain of almost anyone I've ever met. And we always joke that like the perfect book is under 200 pages. And so when I was writing this book, which for the record is like 440 some pages, I think, maybe more. It's a chunker. And when I was writing this, I was like, oh my God, it's so, it really, it just kept getting bigger. And until I wrote this book, I thought of myself as quite an economical or like lean writer. I love short stories precisely because of that economy of language. And I was quite horrified. And I'm sure that Elena, my editor, was horrified as well, because I kept being like, well, it's 120,000 words. And that was not something that either of us ever wanted. And so I had kind of said, I guess you could break it into 3 books. Like I was just completely at a loss. And I mean, the other important factor is that I had worked on this for 4 years, maybe, which for many writers isn't that long a time. But I was working full time while writing, and I just kind of completely started to lose perspective on whether which is really common for writers, but whether the work was any good, whether it sort of merited continuing with, or whether it was like there were so many times where I sort of said to my best friend or then partner or whatever, like I'm going to call the bank and ask for a loan so I can pay this like quite a modest advance back because there's no way I can complete this and kind of honor my contractual agreement. And I don't know, I think the editing process was smoother than I anticipated, in part I think because Elena and I have worked together for so long, almost 10 years, and we kind of do have we're very good friends, as well as having this professional relationship, which is probably quite an unusual thing. I don't know. It was challenging in the sense that it was we were editing during the first year of the pandemic, 2020, and so I'm sure it was very challenging for her, working from home with a young child, and I think deadlines sort of blew out at various times, not for anybody, it wasn't anything she did or I did, but that stuff was challenging. But I love the editing process. It's such a gift to have someone who is sharper than you look at your work and try to help you chisel it into a cleaner and more elegant shape. But I was I guess, sorry, to return to my original point about it being a giant book, I was surprised. I really thought she was going to savage it. And ultimately it was like a lot of it stayed in. She didn't kind of go Gordon Lish on it. I was quite shocked. Certainly there were things that were cut out, but a lot of it remained in place. So
it's interesting, the editing process throughout, at any point during the pandemic, we were all there, everybody watching this. Melbourne, where you and I are, had lockdowns, extensive lockdowns in the year that you were editing this, 2020, and the year that you published this in 2021. Did the pandemic, you don't write about the pandemic, but did it shape the work? Because it must have shaped how you kind of marketed it, turned up to book events. So many of them were on Zoom at that point. Can you kind of explain what it was like to release a book at that point in Australia?
Yeah, so it came out in October 2021, which was, I guess, the year 2 of the pandemic. And in Australia, or in Melbourne, sorry, we were in I believe, the last of 5 lockdowns, with quite sort of strict parameters. So we could leave for an hour of exercise per day. We could walk within a 5-kilometer radius of our houses. It was fairly strict compared to certainly many other cities in Australia. It didn't really affect, for me, the editing process. If anything, it was kind of I think, as I said, we were editing mostly during 2020, and that, I think I was so wrapped up in the newness of what it, I was made redundant from my job that year, and then subsequently I was just so in my own I wasn't thinking about the book, to be honest, because that was that part of the editing process where I was like, it's somebody else's problem. It'll land in my inbox in 4 months. And, I was quite kind of preoccupied with really pragmatic stuff. And then 2021, it was interesting because the book was, I had an online book launch, as many people did. And I remember the first year of the pandemic, I felt really, really bad I continue to feel really bad, but for especially debut authors releasing a book and having an online book launch. And there was something so, I don't know, I just thought, you work so hard for so long, and all you really want is to have, the people that you love most in a room having, terrible boxed wine and celebrating this thing you've created. And there was also so much talk about the book industry at the time, and bookstores taking a hit, and whether independent retail could survive. And it felt quite dark. And then I think I didn't sort of anticipate that I would have an online book launch. And what happened, for me at least, was that, I don't even particularly like doing publicity. I mean, I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I think publicists do a great job, but it's not, my favorite part of the job necessarily. And if you'd said to me 2 years ago, oh, you can't have a book launch, I would have been like, okay, that's like, I'll just go to the pub with some friends, and we'll toast it there, whatever. But the reality of doing something, I was sitting, I think, right here in my studio apartment. It's like 23 meters. It's a famously tiny apartment. And yeah, there was something, it felt very, very sad and very hollow. But you know what? I also feel like I can't complain about it, because this book has had such sort of longevity publicity wise. Like, we're still talking about it, and we're almost halfway through 2023 because of the prizes and nominations. So like, I feel like I have had a fair suck of the sav, to use a disgusting Australian idiom. Like, I feel like I've had my dues, and I feel very lucky. I don't feel as though I sort of have missed out on anything.
Has Bodies of Light been published abroad?
Not yet. It's being published in Spain in May, I believe, by Navona, and so it's being translated into both Spanish and Catalan, which is really cool. And it will be published, I believe, in German, Polish, and Russian. Some interesting territories there. Like, Polish, just from the perspective, I think that's amazing. And I, as somebody who I love reading translation, I do a little bit of freelance translation. This is the first book I've ever had to be published in translation. I'm stoked. It's also very funny to me because we keep talking about how fat it is as a book. And I'm just amazed that, like, anyone in Poland was like, yes, we're going to invest in this massive novel for what seems to me like a relatively small readership. And I think that's amazing. Like, I love it. So
I'm going out on a limb here, but I think that people are investing because the themes are universal, and the story will have played out in every country, in various different ways. But I think, I do think that Bodies of Light will stay in print in Australia for decades. I think that you're going to end up on the tertiary and maybe secondary curriculum list if you're not already there in some parts, and that might make you feel uncomfortable, Jen, or not. I'm not sure. But I think that this book is going to hang around for a while. I am surprised of those territories, with those territories that you just listed. So it's not in the UK or America where it can just be published.
It's available as an audiobook in the States. And I think in the UK, I'm pretty sure in the UK it's an audiobook, but not as not in print, sorry, is what I'm trying to say. Yes.
Yeah. Would you ever, I mean, I don't know if anyone's asked you, but would you ever want to do an international book tour? Bearing in mind that you just said that you don't like talking about, the publicity side of it.
No, I mean, I absolutely, yeah. I love, I've been fortunate enough to do a couple of residencies, artist residencies overseas. And there's something so kind of invigorating about spending time with other artists, and especially like I know this is a city of literature convention, but a couple of or in fact most of the residencies I've done have been interdisciplinary, and I was fortunate enough to be at McDowell a couple of years ago in 2019, and there were some incredible writers present when I was there, but there were also amazing filmmakers and visual artists and musicians and composers, and there is something so I don't know, rich and beautiful about spending time with artists, you know, across different practices, but from different parts of the world as well. And so, you know, a book tour is not the same, thing, but any excuse to spend time in a bookshop, or I don't know, you know, with other readers across the world is going to far outweigh my sort of slight discomfort with microphones, for sure.
You're getting very good with the microphone, Jennifer. Now, we are talking to the Cities of Literature Network, and I think I'd kind of like to take a step back a little bit from your actual book and the contents of it, and kind of talk about how prizes work in Australia. I mean, we've mentioned repeatedly that you took out the big one, and it's, by big I mean it's prestigious. There's quite a lot of money attached to it. It means that you appear in special places in the bookstores, and people always keep it in stock, etc. Can you talk through the process of, because it is a process, of winning and kind of being the Miles Franklin winner for the year, because that imposes quite a bit of stuff on you, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I didn't know. I just didn't know very much about it. I mean, it was so far outside of my
Not
of
many
anything.
people win.
I mean, I never. It was so far outside of anything I ever sort of envisaged or dreamed of for myself that I was kind of almost incurious about it, I suppose. And so when my publisher, as you know, as is the case in most countries, I suspect, but submits the book for any prizes for which it's eligible. And then you're notified, some months in advance. I can't remember exactly when, but it was quite early in the year that I was longlisted for the Miles Franklin. And I think there were 12 titles. And they were really, I mean, this is true every year, of course, but last year I was really, it was a really exciting long list. I think the Miles Franklin, I don't think it's controversial to say that it has a history of being, stale, male, and pale, as they say. And in fact, the Stella Prize, which is awarded to, a woman or non-binary person each year, was set up and established in response to that kind of legacy of white male supremacy in the prize league.
Well said.
And so it felt like a really refreshing shortlist long list rather, in that it represented the kind of breadth and depth of Australian culture and life, which is what the Miles Franklin, one of the stipulations of the or criteria is that the book, the winning book, has to represent some aspect of Australian life, which is kind of quaint and wonderfully broad at the same time. But it was really nice to see a long list that was kind of, it also has to be fiction, sorry, I should say, and a novel, not short stories. It was really exciting to see a long list that that didn't sort of uniquely wrestle with, I don't know, boys in the bush or these kind of colonial hang-ups. It felt really exciting and contemporary, and I was just so stoked to be among that cohort. And then there was a shortlisting ceremony, and I found out I'd been shortlisted, and then they fly you up to Sydney And I was lucky enough to be shortlisted alongside. So on the shortlist, it was Michael Muhammad Ahmed, who wrote The Lebs, The Tribe, and I'm of course blanking on the book that was
I think
the other half of you.
he's been
Sorry.
listed like 3 times for the Miles
Yes,
now.
yeah, he's incredible, and I believe he's the first Muslim Australian writer to be shortlisted. The other half of you, sorry, was the book that he was shortlisted for last year. I'm a shocker for forgetting names as soon as I am in public. And I met him once years ago. He lives in Western Sydney, so I got to meet him. There was Alice Pung, who wrote Unpolished Gem. That was my first encounter with her work. And she was shortlisted for 100 Days. Ooh, I'm sweating over these titles. There was also Michael Winkler, who was the very first self-published author to ever be shortlisted for the Miles Franklin, or longlisted. And he wrote Grimish, which is being published internationally this year. It's an incredible experimental, just like tour de force. Michelle de Kretzer, who was a twice previous winner of the Miles Franklin for Scary Monsters. And who am I missing?
I think that's it. There was only 5.
John Hughes, The Dogs. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Big controversy. I recommend everybody look up.
Yes. I shan't go into it here, but so you get flown up to Sydney, and they did this. I was fortunate that Michael Winkler, author of Grimish, and I were on the same flight. We were the two from Melbourne headed up, and I'd never met him, but I messaged him and I said, if you want to get a cab together to the State Library, and I feel like we were both sort of as green as each other. Like he was just like, what's going on? And I was like, I don't know. They're going to take photos of us apparently at the State Library, and then there was a photo shoot that went for like 3 hours, and I Michael Muhammad knew this was coming because he'd done it twice before, and neither of the other shortlistees, Alice or Michelle, were present. They were both away, so it was just the 3 of us. And I remember Michael and I just kept looking at each other like we weren't ready for it. Like I didn't even iron my dress, it was like I was wearing these boots that were falling apart, and there were well, at this point, none of us knew who the winner was, and I thought it was going to be Michael Winkler for sure. My money was on him. And so you're sort of doing these interviews, and we were taken into this room where they keep all of the titles that have been shortlisted for the Miles Franklin, and it's sort of like you're getting to see the crown jewels. It's very serious. It's very And then there was the shortlisting ceremony that night, which was really lovely because it kind of allowed. It gave the shortlist a lot of airtime, and it allowed everyone to be celebrated, which was beautiful. And the following morning, I got a phone call from Richard Neville, the prize chair, and I was actually on a work Zoom when he called, and I thought it was like my dentist, or like someone calling. Like I feel like we're all getting a lot of scam calls, and so it was lucky that he left a message, because I then knew to phone him back. And then, of course, you can't tell anyone. You sign an NDA and you can't tell anyone for a couple of months. I did. I told my family and some close friends and my editor. And yeah, then when it was announced, I mean, it really, arts coverage in Australia is so limited. Like Murdoch owns 80% of our press. We are a relatively small population, so there's just not the plurality of there's some very good arts criticism and arts coverage, but it's a small economy, I suppose. And yeah, I'd never done as many interviews and things as I had. It's nutty for like I think there was one of the major papers in which like my photo was on, one of the sort of first page 2 or 3 or something, and that feels really insane as a writer, because people pay so little attention to your work, that it felt quite sort of explosive. And then there's sort of the immediate flow on effect of invitations to speak and to do this and that, and there's an influx of sales that was again, compared to many of the world's publishing economies, probably very modest, but felt enormous to me. And even the book being acquired and translated in the foreign rights being acquired, as I said, that had never happened before. And so it felt really, I don't know, there was something really exciting about that. It felt like a real landmark sort of occasion that, you know, your work is reaching more people than it had previously. Yeah.
That was a wonderful description of the Miles Franklin, Jennifer. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I feel like
Um,
I just gave a, I'm gonna move my thing because I'm in the sun. I feel like I just gave a very superficial, and there was a photo shoot that lasted 4 hours and we were really tired. And
You mentioned, you know, seeing the crown jewels in that room in the State Library. I have been in that room, and it is it's a little bit overwhelming. They really do kind of uh make you feel the history of the prize. But you know, this year, I think it was, you know, in 2023, you gave the address at the State of the Writing Nation, which is in Victoria. So, you know, I kind of feel like, without, you know, putting words into your mouth, that like having won that kind of prize now makes you not just the kind of subject for, you know, book reviews or kind of write-ups in arts coverage, but as someone who people come to now for your insight and depth, Jennifer. What's that like? Because I don't know, sometimes I think that we used to in Australia assign that kind of position to, you know, old male, pale and stale, as you mentioned before, you know, somebody who had been around for decades. And you are still very young, Jennifer, and you have not been around for decades, but you have decades ahead of you. What's that like?
I hope I have decades ahead of me. You know, it's I always just feel like everything, like you're only as good as your last work. So who knows? But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think I I published my first book when I was 25. Um, and I'd been working on it for years before that. It wasn't sort of something I cooked up overnight. As I said, I imagine that I would cringe if I went and reread it now. I don't have any desire to do that, but I'll probably cringe if I read Bodies of Light in 10 years. You know, like I think we have to, I know I shouldn't generalize. For me, each work or each book it has to be an opportunity to try something new and to learn something new, because otherwise, why would you keep doing it? I mean, I know there are plenty of writers who you know, astonishingly, you know, like will put out a book every year and yeah, I mean, to cast no aspersions on them, like I kind of think that's amazing, but for me it's such a slow process, and I really there's something about, I don't know, a sense of inquiry there that um like I hope I keep getting better with each one. I don't know, it is interesting. I don't sort of feel like uh, I'm not sure how I feel about the sort of stamp of cultural legitimacy or whatever that you're talking about. Because I agree, I know what you mean. Like there is something about a shiny sticker on a book in Australia and elsewhere, of course, that sort of confers this sense of legitimacy, or it's like, you know, you've been recognized or whatever by the firmament. But at the end of the day, I mean, there's also something so inherently subjective about prizes, you know, like it comes down to timing and sort of luck and who's on the judging panel and what they've read and what they're fatigued of, and all of that, you know, it's such a highly subjective and almost like metaphysical series of factors that go into my winning or even being shortlisted for a prize, that it, you know, of course it's an honor to deliver something like the State of the Writing Nation address, but it's also like, I don't know anything. Like, who am I to, you know, who am I to pontificate about anything when, you know, I'm still doing I'm just plodding along the same way as I was 4 years ago or even a year ago.
You do know some things, Jennifer. Do not talk yourself down. I was a judge of the Stella Prize for 2023,
Mm-hmm.
and I am positive that if there had been a different selection of 5 judges, it would be possible for those 5 judges to come up with 12 entirely different works for the
Yes.
long list. It is inherently subjective, because what is literary? I mean, it's an impossible
Mm-hmm.
thing to define. My final question for you, though, which I hope is easier than the ones I have been throwing at you in the last couple of minutes, but what are you working on next? Because, like, how do you kind of, it'll be your fourth long form work, whether it's short fiction or another novel, but how do you follow up something like the Miles Franklin?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like maybe closer to publication, there'll be a greater sense of expectation or weight. But at the moment, um, I don't know. I'm trying to look at it as I'm trying to sort of look at it with a sense of equanimity in that we already said no one book is for every person, and there will be people who will want a second Bodies of Light and who will be disappointed that they don't get it. And there will be people who read Bodies of Light, hated it, and won't go back for whatever I write next. I think I'm just inevitably prepared for people to be I don't know, disappointed or whatever. But it's also, there's a part of me that's like, well, I won this prize that, for better or worse, as we say, does sort of give you that gold sticker. And there's something a little bit freeing about that. It's like, what do I have to prove? Even as I'm saying, prizes are subjective and blah 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 blah. There's a part of me that kind of feels like, well, I've achieved this thing that I never dreamed of achieving, so I might as well just sort of play around and have fun. And that's what I've been doing. I'm kind of working on two things in parallel. I'm working on another collection of short fiction, which is sort of my first love. But then I'm also working on a story about a novel rather about it's set in the sketch comedy scene in Melbourne over a period of years. And I just sort of wanted to look at like the arts economy and the ways that young artists sort of age out of that, whether we become middle class or, we decide we're too old to keep plugging along for no money, and we become teachers, or we do something that's safer, and the ways that we sort of sell out or don't sell out and things like that. And it's very different from anything I've written before. And it's kind of been a pleasure to just sit with something new and to try and puzzle my way through that. And that's how I'm trying to look at it, Astrid. But I'm sure, like, closer to publication, I'll be a nervous wreck, because I get very scared thinking about how work is received beyond my editor.
I am sorry for asking you that question, but also I am deeply intrigued by a long form work examining the arts economy and how we all become teachers or age out. That describes like more than half the writers in Melbourne, at least. So
yes, yeah. I really wanted to look at kind of working artists, I suppose, because that is the Australian arts economy. So
it really is.
Yeah,
Jennifer, thank you so much for this chat.
Oh, thank you so much.
And also thank you to the Cities of Literature, in particular, yes. Melbourne City of Literature. There will be more in this series, Between the Lines. Thank you all.
Thank you.